And now on Radio 4, time to keep the light on, perhaps, as we begin a new series of ghost stories by Algernon Blackwood. Tonight's tale is Keeping His Promise.
It was 11 o'clock at night, and young Marriott was locked into his room, cramming as hard as he could cram. He'd been ploughed for this particular examination so often that his parents had positively declared they could no longer supply the funds to keep him there. So Marriott pulled himself together at last and made up his mind that he would pass or die in the attempt. And for some weeks now he'd been reading as hard as mortal man can read. His friends had promised not to disturb him. It was, therefore, with feelings a good deal stronger than mere surprise that he heard his doorbell ring on this particular night. Marriott jumped up from his books, unlocked the door, and passed into the little hallway with considerable wrath and annoyance. The stone staircase, dimly lighted at each floor by a gas jet that would not turn above a certain height, wound down to the level of the street with no pretence at carpet or railing. The acoustic properties of a spiral staircase seemed to be peculiar. Marriott, standing by the open door, thought every moment the owner of the footsteps would come into view. The sound of the boots was so close and so loud that they seemed to travel disproportionately in advance of their cause. But the man did not appear. A sudden queer sensation of fear passed over him, a faintness and a shiver down the back. He was just debating whether he would call aloud to his invisible visitor or slam the door and return to his books, when the cause of the disturbance turned the corner very slowly and came into view. He saw a youngish man. His face was the colour of a piece of chalk, and the eyes, which were very bright, had heavy lines underneath them. Though the cheeks and chin were unshaven and the general appearance unkempt, the man was evidently a gentleman. But he wore no hat, and although rain had been falling steadily all the evening, he appeared to have neither overcoat nor umbrella. Almost at once the caller turned his head a little so that the gaslight in the hall fell upon his features from a new angle. Then in a flash Marriott recognized him. "Field, man alive, is it you?" he gasped. They had been at a private school together years before, and though they had hardly met once since, the news had not failed to reach him from time to time with considerable detail. Young Field had gone wild. He remembered hearing about it all. Drink, a woman, he could not exactly call to mind. "Come in," he said at once, his anger vanishing. "Come in and tell me all about it, and perhaps I can help." He hardly knew what to say. He led the way across the hall. The other, though certainly sober, was unsteady on his legs, and evidently much exhausted. Marriott might not be able to pass his examinations, but he at least knew the symptoms of starvation. "Come along," he said. "I'm glad to see you. I was going to have a bite of something to eat, and you're just in time to join me." Marriott took his arm by way of support. He was as thin as a skeleton. As he touched him, the sensation of faintness and dread returned. It only lasted a moment, and he ascribed it not unnaturally to the distress and shock of seeing a former friend in such a pitiful plight. He led him to the sofa. "I'll get supper ready. Don't bother to talk, just take it easy. I see you're dead tired. You can tell me about it afterwards, and we'll make plans." The other sat down on the edge of the sofa and stared in silence. His eyes shone with a brightness that suggested drugs, Marriott thought, stealing a glance at him from behind the cupboard door. The fellow was in a bad way. So he let his visitor rest while he busied himself with the supper. "Now, let's tuck in," he said, "and afterwards we'll have a pipe and a chat." He looked up and caught his guest's eyes directed straight upon his own. An involuntary shudder ran through him from head to foot. The face opposite him was a deadly white, and wore a dreadful expression of pain and mental suffering. "By gad," he said, jumping up, "I quite forgot. I've got some whiskey somewhere. What an ass I am." He went to the cupboard and poured out a stiff glass, which the other swallowed at a single gulp. Marriott watched him while he drank it, and at the same time noticed something else as well. Field's coat was all over dust, and on one shoulder was a bit of cobweb. It was perfectly dry. Field arrived on a soaking wet night without hat, umbrella, or overcoat, and yet perfectly dry, even dusty. It was very strange. They ate their supper together while the host carried on a running one-sided conversation, chiefly about himself and his exams. But while he toyed with his food, Field ate like an animal, gobbled, stuffed, gorged. Marriott forgot his reading and began to feel something very much like a lump in his throat. "I shall be up all night reading for this blessed exam. You're more than welcome to my bed. Tomorrow we'll have a late breakfast and see what can be done." Field appeared to acquiesce, and the other led the way into the bedroom. The weary guest staggered across the room and dropped his exhausted body on the bed. In less than a minute he was to all appearances sound asleep. Marriott watched him, wondering what he would do with his unbidden guest. But the call of his books was imperative. He sat down and resumed his notes. But his thoughts kept wandering. He recalled their school days together before they had drifted apart, and how they had vowed eternal friendship, and all the rest of it. And now, through the half-open door, the bedroom led out of the sitting room and had no other door, came the sound of deep, long-drawn breathing, the regular, steady breathing of a tired man, so tired that even to listen to it made Marriott almost want to go to sleep himself. He needed it, reflected the student, and perhaps it came only just in time. There was nothing to disturb the worker but an occasional rush of wind against the windows and a pain in his arm. This bothered him, and he tried to remember how and when he could have bruised himself so severely, but without success. At length the page before him turned from yellow to grey. It was 4 o'clock. Marriott leaned back and yawned prodigiously. Field was still breathing heavily in the next room, and he first tiptoed across the floor to take another look at him. Peering cautiously round the half-open door, his first glance fell upon the bed, now plainly discernible in the grey light of morning. He stared hard. Then he rubbed his eyes. He stared harder still and harder. But it made no difference at all. He was staring into an empty room. The sensation of fear he had felt when Field first appeared upon the scene returned suddenly, but with much greater force. He became conscious, too, that his left arm was throbbing violently and causing him great pain. He was trembling from head to foot. By a great effort of the will, he left the support of the door and walked forward boldly into the room. There, upon the bed, was the impress of a body. There was the mark of the head on the pillow, and the slight indentation at the foot of the bed where the boots had rested on the counterpane. And there, plainer than ever, for he was closer to it, was the breathing. With a great effort he found his voice and called his friend aloud by name. "Field, is that you? Where are you?" There was no reply. The breathing continued without interruption, coming directly from the bed, but there was no sign of anyone. Curious thoughts began to trouble Marriott's mind. A cold perspiration broke out all over his body, and the sound of heavy breathing all this time never ceased to come from the corner where Field had lain down to sleep. He went back into his sitting room, opened the windows, and tried to think the whole matter over quietly and clearly. The thing was incredible. It was absurd. Haunted by visions of brain fever and insanity, Marriott put on his cap and mackintosh and left the house. The morning air would blow the cobwebs from his brain. He did not return until the exercise had shaken some of the horror out of his bones. As he entered, he saw that there was another man in the room, standing against the windows with his back to the light. He recognized his fellow student Green, who was reading for the same examination. "Thought I'd drop in here to compare notes and have some breakfast. Didn't know you had any friends who drank, Marriott." Marriott replied dryly that he did not know it either. "Sounds as if some chap were sleeping it off in there, doesn't it, though?" persisted the other, with a nod in the direction of the bedroom. "Then you can hear it too, thank God," Marriott said earnestly.
Of course I can hear it.
I'm awfully relieved, said Marriott. And thereupon he related exactly what had happened during the night, even down to the pain in his arm. You hear the breathing now plainly, don't you? He said. Green said he did. Well, come with me, and we'll search the room together. The other, however, did not move from his chair.
I've been in already, he said sheepishly. I heard the sounds and thought it was you. The door was ajar, so I went in.
Green questioned his friend very closely, but without illuminating result, since questions cannot alter facts. The only thing that ought to have a proper logical explanation is the pain in my arm, said Marriott. It hurts so infernally and aches all the way up. I can't remember bruising it there. Marriott rolled up his sleeve. By George, I'm bleeding, he exclaimed. On the forearm, quite close to the wrist, was a thin red line. There was a tiny drop of apparently fresh blood on it. Marriott sat very still, staring silently at his arm.
What's the matter? I see nothing very strange about a scratch, said Green.
But Marriott leaned forward close to his friend's face. Look, he said in a low voice. Do you see that red mark? I mean, underneath what you call the scratch.
Yes, I see, returned the other. It looks like an old scar.
It is an old scar, whispered Marriott, his lips trembling. The field made that scar.
You mean last night?
No, years ago. At school, with his knife. And I made a scar in his arm with mine. We exchanged drops of blood in each other's cuts.
In the name of heaven, what for?
It was a boys' compact. We'd been reading some dreadful book, and we swore to appear to one another. I mean, whoever died first swore to show himself to the other. And we sealed the compact with each other's blood. And I've never thought of it again to this day.
And you mean?
Stammered Green. But Marriott made no answer. He got up and crossed the room, and lay down wearily upon the sofa, hiding his face in his hands. Green walked over to the bedroom, opened the door, and listened. The sound of deep, regular breathing came floating through the air. Green closed the door and came back.
There's only one thing to do, he declared. Write home and find out about him. And meanwhile, come and finish your reading in my rooms. I've got an extra bed.
Agreed, returned the other. And this was what they did. It was about a week later when Marriott got an answer from his sister. Part of it he read to Green. It is curious that you should have inquired after Field. Sir John's patience became exhausted, and he turned him out of the house. Well, what do you think? It looks like suicide. Instead of leaving the house, he went down into the cellar and simply starved himself to death. They're trying to suppress it, of course, but I heard it all from the maid. They found his body on the 14th, and the doctor said he had died about 12 hours before. He was dreadfully thin. And he died on the 13th, said Green. Marriott nodded. That's the very night he came to see you. Marriott nodded again.
Matthew Marsh was reading Keeping His Promise by Algernon Blackwood. The story was abridged by Robin Brooks and produced by Clive Brill. It was a Pacificus production for BBC Radio 4.
In his luxurious flat, the elderly Mr. Adam sat before the fire with a frown upon his face. His secretary had gone home, taking away with her the dictated chapters of his book, his 20th novel. His 20th successful novel, he remembered with a smile that momentarily displaced the frown. How I Started. He read the typed sentence before him. He remembered quite well what made him first begin to write. It had been due to a shock. A shock, some say, can bring out latent possibilities in the mind hitherto ignored. The shock had been the sudden, total loss of the comfortable fortune he had been brought up to expect. His guardian had played ducks and drakes with it. His anger against the guardian was of that bitter kind that could have killed. He still remembered, with a smile today, how he finally dismissed the idea from his mind. What's the use? He'd reflected bitterly. Even if I did murder him, the state would only murder me in return. I should be hanged. Who murders is murdered in his turn. What could he do to earn his living? He thought of many fields and callings, but realized he was trained for none. The choice of work, of something that he could do, troubled him obsessingly. He'd been walking for some time, and now he found himself wandering towards the waterfront of the ancient port that was his hometown. He thought of a cousin who had just gone to some job or other in China. Then, glancing up, his eye caught suddenly 5 little words, whose faded black letters shone in a patch of sunshine on the dull brick wall above his head. He stood and stared. It was merely the name of the alley, of course, yet thought took a new turn. A kind of enchantment stole over him. The 5 little words were almost a line of poetry. The Land of Green Ginger was what the young Mr. Adam read. Then he started down the twisting alley until his eye noted suddenly an old furniture shop with its queer wares overflowing onto the narrow pavement. A circular mirror, standing on a 3-legged pedestal nearly 6 feet high, reflected his figure as he moved idly towards the shop. He saw himself reflected, his smart flannel suit, his eyeglass, his straw hat with its Oxford colours. He also saw a bent, thin little old man with a skull cap on his head, standing among the shadows a few feet inside, beyond the dingy doorway. This figure now moved slowly towards him. "A fine piece, a perfect bit of glass, cheap too. It come from China 30 years ago." Adam entered the shop, the old man backing away before him. The interior was dark, and much larger than the small entrance promised. A single oil lamp revealed a series of deep, narrow rooms, cluttered up with stuff, among which the bent figure now set down the mirror carefully, for he had carried it in with him. In the dimness, the young man found his own reflection more attractive than before. It was softened. The wheezy voice was mentioning a price. Rather a trumpery price, considered Mr. Adam, a few shillings only. He went closer to examine it. He bent down, noticing an inscription cut deeply into the dark wood of the framework. It was in Chinese characters. He ran his fingers over them, then looked up to ask. "Who looks in me," translated the wheezy voice, "murders, and is murdered." The young man felt his body give an imperceptible twitch he was unable to suppress. His mind likewise gave a twitch. Was it uneasiness? It was, at any rate, surprise, while at the same time he was aware that something drew him, so that he found himself following the retreating figure, who now, still carrying the mirror with him, was on the threshold of the next long room. It was the 3rd extension of the premises, and it was considerably darker than the first 2 rooms. A chilliness hung in the fusty atmosphere. The place seemed lonely suddenly. Aware of a faint tremor in him, though not yet of anything more than that, he spoke in a brusque, almost an aggressive voice. "And what may such rubbish mean?" he inquired sharply. "Precisely what it says," came the wheezy voice. There was an unpleasant hush in it, and there came a look into the face that hardly invited merriment. "Does it hold good?" Mr. Adam challenged. "If I buy the thing, for instance, do you mean to tell me that you already before me—" He could not finish the sentence. A shudder stopped his breath, and the voice died on his lips. While speaking, he had been looking, not into the old man's face, but into the mirror, where he still saw his own reflection. But it was not this that stopped his speech and froze his blood. It was something else he saw. With one wrinkled hand the old shopman still clutched the pedestal, but in the other was an unsheathed knife. "So far it has held good," came his whisper down the long, dim room, and as he spoke he tilted the mirror to a slightly different angle. The young man saw himself in the glass as before, but he now saw something else behind him too. It lay stretched upon the floor, motionless, crumpled dreadfully, its position not quite natural. One arm was twisted about the face at an angle not possible to life. In the narrow fairway of the room behind him, the room he had already passed, this pitiful, repulsive body lay. To stand where he now stood, the young man realized, he must actually have stepped over it. "You did that?" he gasped, in a voice that emitted hardly any sound. "He looked in the mirror," came the whispered answer. "What do you expect?" And before that, he, in turn, "It works that way," the other gave back with an awful grin. Adam felt his body stiffen, yet the blood began to flow in tumult. He felt his fists clench tightly. With his eyes fixed on the shopman, and not leaving him for a single instant, he saw that the old man, letting go of the mirror, had suddenly begun to dodge. Light-footed he was, amazingly agile, quick, his movements convulsive, horribly alert. He dodged sideways, backwards, swift as a shadow round his customer, who watched the hideous dance with arrested muscles and with spellbound eyes. The knife gleamed and flashed. Adam made an effort that seemed to wrench his heart, and the muscles began to function again. His instinct of self-preservation woke. Instinctively he picked up a heavy iron mace from a teakwood table close beside him. With a strain he could just lift it. "It's up to me then now, is it?" he cried, his own feet shifting quickly. "I can defend myself," shrieked the shopman, dodging with incredible rapidity. "If that's any good to you," he yelled, shooting across the floor as an arrow flies, and brandishing his knife. Moved by a sudden power that surprised himself, the young man leapt towards the pirouetting horror. He made one bound. He swung his heavy mace. The great weapon crashed down upon the ancient skull, driving the cap deep into the split bone. The figure stopped abruptly, uttered a tiny squeak, crumpled, and lay like a great mutilated insect where it fell. It did not move again. "Murders and is murdered," the young man tried to scream, his voice, as in extreme nightmare agony, making no sound upon the air. "I've done you in, at any rate. Then it's my turn next, is it?" He turned swiftly, with the feeling that someone watched him from behind. A tall figure, sure enough, darkened the distant door into the street, the outline of a stranger who bent a little to examine something that stood upon the pavement just outside. The young man stared and stared. Though in semi-darkness himself, the outline was clearly defined in the evening light. But was it a stranger? He wore a smart flannel suit, a straw hat with Oxford colours. As he straightened up, an eyeglass became visible. Mr. Adam shot round and stared at the crumpled heap upon the floor at his feet. It was not the shopman. An electric shock flowed over him. What he stared down at was a neat flannel suit, a straw hat with Oxford colours. He shrieked. He raced headlong down the room, straight towards the street door, towards the stranger with the tall outline. And this tall outline now came gliding to meet him, very swiftly gliding, silently too, making no sound upon the boarded floor, just as he had seen his own reflected image gliding towards himself in the mirror before. Closer it came, and closer, something oddly, dreadfully familiar about it, something that he almost recognized. It came remorselessly nearer. He could not have stopped it if he tried. Like fate, his own fate, he must meet it. He could not avoid it, because he somehow welcomed it. He did not pause himself. He even moved faster, till there was but a foot between them. Terrified he was, yet at the same time his courage rose. They met. They slipped into one another. They emerged, and instantaneously though this came about, he had time to recognize himself, and that same second to find himself standing on the pavement outside, gazing at a mirror on a high three-legged pedestal, while a little thin, bent old man faced him, wearing a skull-cap and rubbing his hands. It was the shopman, evidently, scenting a possible customer. "A fine piece," the old man wheezed, his eyes pierced like gimlets. "And cheap, too. It come from China 30 year ago." A wave of pleasant, even delightful emotion fluttered through the young man's heart as he bent to read an inscription carved in Chinese characters upon the wooden frame. He ran his finger over them, then looked up to ask. "To each," the wheezy voice translated, 10,000 futures, yet each must choose his own," and went on to explain how a learned gentleman had once kindly deciphered the words for him. Only the young man was no longer listening. He was staring intently at the upper part of the frame. "But the frame's empty," he cried out loud. "There is no mirror." And again that marvellous emotion passed fluttering across his heart. "It got broke," he heard the wheezy voice explaining. "Got broke on the voyage over. But it's easy put in again, me lord. A fine old piece." He mentioned a trumpery price, a few shillings merely. Young Mr. Adam bought it and took it home with him, and one evening he scribbled an account of his adventure in the land of green ginger. Later he wrote other, longer adventures too. He had inside him, it seems, some queer gift of scribbling imaginary, possibly imaginative adventures. A shock had brought it to the surface. Next morning, the elderly Mr. Adam dictated to his secretary a few commonplace paragraphs about how I started to write. "Send it to the editor," he told his secretary, "with a line to say I hope it is what he wants. He need not use it otherwise, of course." And as he dictated the paragraphs, his eye wandered to a mirror on a high three-legged pedestal, which oddly had no glass, and which the elderly Mr. Adam knew had never had one, nor ever would.
Matthew Marsh was reading The Land of Green Ginger by Algernon Blackwood. The story was abridged by Robin Brooks and produced by Clive Brill. It was a Pacificus production for BBC Radio 4.
The child began to cry in the early afternoon. I remember the hour, because I had been listening with secret relief to the sound of the departing carriage, those wheels fading into the distance down the gravel drive with Mrs. Freen and her daughter Gladys, to whom I was governess, meant for me some hours' welcome rest, and the June day was oppressively hot. Moreover, there was this excitement in the little country household that had told upon us all. Mr. Freen Senior, Uncle Frank, was expected for an unusual visit from town about tea-time. I also knew that his visit was concerned somehow with the future welfare of little Jamie, Gladys's 7-year-old brother. More than this, indeed, I never knew. I only gathered that the visit of Uncle Frank was of a condescending nature, that Jamie was told he must be upon his very best behaviour to make a good impression, and that Jamie, who had never seen his uncle, dreaded him horribly already in advance. I recalled his white distress that morning when told that Uncle Frank was motoring down for tea, and that he was to be very nice indeed to him. "The man with the enormous face?" he had asked in a little voice of awe, and then gone speechless from the room in tears that no amount of soothing could calm. I feared for him. For all that commonplace household, I loved Jamie best, though professionally I had nothing to do with him. It seemed to me that no one understood him, least of all his honest, tender-hearted parents, so that his little wailing voice brought me from my bed to the window in a moment, like a call for help. The haze of June lay over that big garden like a blanket. I saw him down beyond the garden, standing in his white sailor suit, alone. He was down by the ugly patch, where nothing grew, the forbidden corner. Then Mr. Freen came into the garden, and Jamie turned and ran as though some spell had broken just in time, ran into the open arms of his fond but uncomprehending father. That treeless, flowerless spot stood at the far end of the magnificent rose garden, a bald, sore place where the black earth showed uglily in winter, almost like a piece of dangerous bog, and in summer baked and cracked with fissures. Behind it stood the thick wood of silver birches. The gardeners had a very simple explanation for its barrenness, that the water all drained off it, owing to the lie of the slopes immediately about it, holding no remnant to keep the soil alive. It was Jamie who felt its spell and haunted it, and for whom it was finally labelled strictly out of bounds because it stimulated his already big imagination. It was Jamie who buried ogres there, and heard it crying in an earthy voice, swore it shook its surface sometimes while he watched it, and secretly gave it food in the form of birds or mice or rabbits he found dead upon his wanderings. "It's bad, Miss Gould," he told me. "But, Jamie, nothing in nature is bad, exactly, only different from the rest sometimes. Then it's empty. It's not fed. It's dying because it can't get the food it wants. It's hungry, don't you see? But I know what would make it feel all right." I remember that I shrank from asking explanation. Mr. Freen Sr. had been so frequently the subject of conversation in the family since I came. I had then read so much about him in the papers, his energy, his philanthropy, his success with everything he laid his hand to, that a picture of the man had grown complete within me. I knew him as he was, within, or as my sister would have said, clairvoyantly. For this Mr. Freen was a man who drooped alone, but grew vital in a crowd, because he used their vitality. He was a supreme, unconscious artist in the science of taking the fruits of others' work and living for his own advantage. Others fed him. In the man's immediate neighbourhood, you felt his presence draining you. He took your ideas, your strength, your very words, and later used them for his own benefit and aggrandizement. Not evilly, of course. The man was good enough. But you felt that he was dangerous, owing to the facile way he absorbed himself into all loose vitality that was to be had. He went about carrying these accumulations of the life of others. In this sense, his life was not really his own. For the same reason, I think, it was not so fully under his control as he imagined. I shall never forget the sensation of icy shrinking and distress with which I heard the rumble of the car. He had arrived. Tea was already on the lawn, and Mrs. Freen and Gladys, back from their drive, were sitting in wicker chairs. Mr. Freen Jr. was in the hall to meet his brother, but Jamie, as I learnt afterwards, had shown such hysterical alarm, offered such bold resistance, that it had been deemed wiser to keep him in his room. The instant I came upon the lawn, I hesitate to set it down, it sounds so foolish, disconnected. I could have sworn, as my eyes met his, that a kind of sudden darkness came, taking the summer brilliance out of everything. And it was caused by troops of small black horses that raced about us from his person to attack. After a first momentary approving glance, he took no further notice of me. The tea and talk went smoothly. Jamie was never mentioned. Outwardly, all seemed well, but inwardly, everything was awful, skirting the edge of things unspeakable. I watched his hard, bleak face. I noticed how thin he was, and the curious, oily brightness of his steady eyes. They did not glitter, but they drew you with a sort of soft, creamy shine like Eastern eyes. Before 5 minutes had passed, however, I was aware of one thing only. Separated merely by some dozen yards or so, this man, vibrating with the acquired vitality of others, stood within easy reach of that spot of yawning emptiness, waiting and eager to be filled. These two active centres were within fighting distance, he so thin, so hard, so keen, yet really spreading large with the loose surround of others' life he had appropriated, so practised and triumphant. That other, so patient, deep, with so mighty a draw of the whole earth behind it, and so obviously aware that its opportunity at last had come. The conflict would be hideously unequal. The first evidence he gave that something was going wrong with him was when his voice grew suddenly confused, and his lips trembled a moment and turned flabby. The next second his face betrayed that singular and horrid change, growing somehow loose about the bones of the cheek, and larger, so that I remembered Jamie's miserable phrase. The emissaries of the two kingdoms, the human and the vegetable, had met. For the first time in his long career of battening on others, Mr. Freen Sr. found himself pitted against a vaster kingdom than he knew, and, so finding, shook inwardly in that little part that was his definite actual self. He felt the huge disaster coming. "Yes, John," he was saying, in his drawling, self-congratulating voice. "Sir George gave me that car. Gave it to me as a present, wasn't it, John?" And then he broke off abruptly, stammered, drew breath, stood up and looked uneasily about him. "What's that?" he cried. "What's that horrid place? And someone's crying there. Who is it?" Before anyone could answer, he started across the lawn towards it. Before anyone could move, he stood upon the edge. He leaned over, peering down into it. Each side was intensely active, but only one side, the human, exerted all its force in resistance. The other merely stretched out a feeler, as it were, from its vast potential strength. No more was necessary. It was such a soft and easy victory. There was no bluster or great effort. Close by his side I witnessed it, for I, it seemed, alone had moved and followed him. No one else stirred, though Mrs. Freen clattered noisily with the cups, making some sudden impulsive gesture with her hands, and Gladys, I remember, gave a cry. It was like a little scream. "Mother, it's the heat, isn't it?" Mr. Freen, her father, was speechless, pale as ashes. But the instant I reached his side, it became clear what had drawn me there thus instinctively. Upon the other side, among the silver birches, stood little Jamie. He was watching. A liquid fear ran all over me. And then it happened. A truly wicked sight. I think he understood vaguely that if someone could only take his place, he might be saved. And that was why he saw the child and called aloud to him across the empty patch, "James, my boy, come here." I heard my own voice ring out, though I was not conscious of saying it. "Jamie, don't move. Stay where you are." But Jamie obeyed neither of us. Moving up nearer to the edge, he stood there, laughing. I heard that laughter, but could have sworn it did not come from him. The empty, yawning patch gave out that sound. Mr. Freen turned sideways, throwing up his arms. I saw his hard, bleak face grow somehow wider, spread through the air and downwards. A similar thing, I saw, was happening at the same time to his entire person, for it drew out into the atmosphere in a stream of movement. What actually happened, I clearly understood, was that all this vitality and life that he had transferred from others to himself for years was now in turn being taken from him and transferred elsewhere. One moment on the edge, he wobbled horribly. Then with that queer sideways motion, he stepped forward into the middle of the patch and fell heavily upon his face. Again, I thought of a troop of small black horses galloping away down a subterranean passage beneath my feet, plunging into the depths, their tramping growing fainter and fainter into buried distance. In my nostrils was a pungent smell of earth. And then, all passed. I came back into myself. Mr. Freen, Jr. was lifting his brother's head from the lawn where he had fallen from the heat, close beside the tea table. He had never really moved from there. And Jamie, I learned afterwards, had been the whole time asleep upon his bed upstairs, worn out with his crying and unreasoning alarm. Gladys came running out with cold water, sponge and towel, brandy too, all kinds of things. "Mother, it was the heat, wasn't it?" I heard her whisper. But I did not catch Mrs. Freen's reply. From her face it struck me that she was bordering on collapse herself. Then the butler followed, and they just picked him up and carried him into the house. He recovered even before the doctor came. But the queer thing to me is that I was convinced the others all had seen what I saw, only that no one said a word about it. And to this day, no one has said a word. And that was, perhaps, the most horrid part of all. From that day to this, I have scarcely heard a mention of Mr. Freen, Sr. It seemed as if he dropped suddenly out of life. The papers never mentioned him. His activities ceased, as it were. Certainly he achieved nothing worth public mention. The afterlife of that empty patch of garden, however, was quite otherwise. Even before I left in the following summer, it had changed. It lay untouched, full of great, luscious, driving weeds and creepers, very strong, full-fed and bursting, thick with life.
Ruth Gemmell was reading The Transfer by Algernon Blackwood. The story was abridged by Robin Brooks and produced by Clive Brill. It was a Pacificus production for BBC Radio 4.
If it is true that most people have one secret they never share, it is also true that many have an experience they never tell. Not so much from fear of ridicule or being disbelieved as from utter inability to describe it intelligibly. Language has grown gradually. It describes the experience of the race. Anything beyond human experience exposes the poverty of language at once. No words exist. Professor Zeit had something of this sort, it seems. He was an ardent physicist, astrophysics his speciality. He knew all about waves. He was one of the few who really understood relativity. He was a wireless expert, too. He chatted as easily about other dimensions in time as most people do about shares and commodities. Conceptions of time beyond our one-dimensional kind were always in his thoughts. He was also an experimenter. He made, it appears, audacious experiments, some of them psychological. That he ever suffered from overwork, from cerebral excitement of a rather dangerous sort, is open to question. To myself, who enjoyed the privilege, or suffered the affliction, of hearing his experience, there seemed no sign of delusion, hallucination, or mental disturbance. I remain convinced that he told me something that had actually happened to an able, clear-headed, if unusual man. It happened to him on a winter's night as he sat alone in his flat. A Sunday evening, the servants out, and his wife away in Paris. His married life was unhappy, childless, ill-assorted. He had made a mistake. There was another girl he should have chosen. Now, at 40, he realized this, though without undue bitterness, for he blamed himself. His wife's money had made his career possible. This particular day had been passed in strenuous exercise. His body, he admits, was overtired, perhaps, but his mind, at any rate, was resting delightfully. He was reading a story of crime over the fire. Delicious relaxation, he called it. The room was dim, only the reading lamp turned on. Facing him in the wall was a long pier glass. The book, It Doesn't Pay, was the life of a burglar told by himself. Black, if memory serves me, the author, and he was near the end. In his mind, as he read the last chapter, stretched a picture of the man's whole life, not actually realized, perhaps, but lying there in perspective. Like a map, it existed serially and all at once, though he now focused attention on its close. The whole of the burglar's life lay between the book covers. It was present, any portion of it accessible by turning back the pages. Its end was vivid at the moment merely because he, Zeit, focused attention upon that part, that moment. And so, as was usual with him, he realized that his own life similarly existed serially, complete, the whole map there, while he was conscious of himself at the moment called 40, merely because he focused attention on that moment. Only in his own case, time made turning back impossible. If time had another dimension, he could have turned back to earlier sections. He admits his general awareness of this idea in the background of his mind, for it was habitual. Such ideas lay always in his thought. But at the moment, thought and interest were centered on Black's adventures, these other ideas not consciously to the fore, when something in the semi-darkened room suddenly drew his attention. The room, he felt positive, had altered, and this alteration was in his immediate surroundings. Very close to him this abrupt change had come about, and he looked up from his page, startled a little, as though an unexpected sound had disturbed me, were his words. The winter's night was still, the Sunday traffic negligible, the flat empty. Yet he was positive that someone stood in the room in close proximity to him. As he raised his eyes, he looked automatically at the reflection of himself in the pier glass opposite. He saw himself deep in the easy chair, the open book on his knee, the shaded lamp behind his head, and at the same instant saw also the reflection of a tall, straight figure that passed swiftly behind his chair from right to left. Simultaneously with this, and before thought had time to spread, he felt something that, he declares, he had never felt before, something entirely new. Accustomed mentally to contemplate ultimate zero and the colds of outer space, he was instantly conscious now that all about him, in brain and nerves as well, was a sudden cold of another kind altogether, a kind hitherto unexperienced. This cold brought horror with it. He felt as if hanging in interstellar space, adrift from all known moorings, on the brink of something that horrified because it was utterly unknown. By unknown he meant he had never experienced it himself. There was no up or down, because there was nothing to which up or down could be referred. Similarly, backwards or forwards held no meaning. Nor could he know whether he was in motion or stationary. He was merely relative. With a tremendous effort, however, he managed to cling tenaciously with his ordinary mind to ordinary, familiar standards. In the first second, all this came to him. At the same time, he knew that the figure now passing behind his chair would appear in a fractional moment beside or in front of him. And even as he realized this, it happened. The figure moved beside him, then in front, then stopped, and looked at him. Expecting his muscles somehow to be paralyzed by the shock of unusual fear, and that he would be unable to move, he now found that this was not the case. As he saw the tall, straight figure come to a dead stop in front of him, not 2 feet away, he rose quickly to his feet and faced it. The book fell to the carpet with a thud. It was a young man he looked at straight in the eyes. He was able, even at this moment, to note his sensations. The habit of years worked truly. The intense, strange, different cold, he thus asserts, persisted. It numbed something in him that must have otherwise reasoned, reflected, criticized. These faculties, at any rate, did not function. All that happened seemed not natural, supernatural. The sensation of unbelievable fear that had turned him dizzy was gone. Having terrorized him, it disappeared. His breath became oddly, immensely accelerated. An idea of death slipped his thought. But all these, passing, left an exhilaration beyond all words. It was under this intensification of consciousness that he then at once began to speak. The figure spoke too. They spoke together. He emphasized this simultaneous utterance, though the spoken words were not always quite identical. "Of course I know you. I know who you are," he said. "You are myself." The figure, a young man in a light summery suit, smiled eagerly. "I was 25 then," said Zeit. "I am 25, said the other. And as they uttered together came all the emotions of troubled love, of doubt, of being drawn in two different directions by worldly considerations and by personal inclination, with all the fever of a young man's indecision. "If only I could see ahead," Zeit heard himself saying, while simultaneously sounded, "If only I could go back." They looked into each other's eyes while uttering the next words, identical words this time. "I exist at that point where my attention is fixed at a given moment. But there's really no need to. I can choose my moment, alter my attention, forwards or backwards. Can't I?" The young figure smiled, a curiously passionate expression in the eyes. In Zeit rose the tumultuous passion for a girl, as against the affection and respect for another girl whose worldly possessions would enable him to follow his dream. "I can go backwards or forwards," both spoke together, "by changing my type of consciousness. It's open, it's here, it's now, both accessible as between the covers of a book, if only I escape from being fixed on a point so stupidly. If only I knew how." "I do," grinned the other, while Zeit laughed audibly, a laugh of audacious triumph, using the same words exactly. "I do. I can change my consciousness, make it different," cried Zeit. "I see the way. My life is serial, all at once, whole. I am not fixed at any point. I am in time of 2 dimensions. "I always am," said the other, bending his head down to read a letter whose wet ink still glistened. "I will destroy it. I won't send it," exclaimed Zeit, despising himself for proposing to a girl he did not really love. The young figure tore the letter he held into tiny pieces and turned to throw them into the fire. But there was no fire, only a gas stove burning, and the room was a shabby lodging-house room. Zeit gazed about him. The picture of the girl he really loved possessed his mind. "I'll go to her, go back to her. I'll go tomorrow." His speech fumbled slightly. "I'll go to her now," said the figure decisively, his young face alight, as he moved across the faded carpet to a waste paper basket beside the draughty window. "I'll change it, change the past." And Zeit realized he was shouting now, aloud, amazing joy and wonder in him, as he watched the shower of small torn bits of paper flutter down. The figure came suddenly very close, so close that there seemed hardly room to stand without touching, as though space could not possibly contain both of them on that one spot. Then closer still, all over one another. That would be too dislocating for others. "And until all can do it," sounded the voice very faintly. Professor Zeit declares it sounded inside himself. "I'll make the effort anyhow. A result of sorts may come." The voice died out. The figure was no longer there. Zeit, the physicist, found himself alone. He stooped down and picked up the fallen book. The heat of the blazing coal fire scorched his face, but did not affect the curious internal cold that lay like a touch from interstellar space over his entire being. He turned on all the lights, and before sitting down to finish Black's book, he wrote down the dialogue and description as given above. It was bald, but as accurate as he could make it. Long afterwards, as I listened to his account, watching his face, I saw a light in his eyes I have never seen before in any human eyes. The major part of the experience, he added, is beyond any power or words at my command. The distinguished man, now famous and happily remarried, smiled as he said this. He shivered a little. "They'd say I dreamed it," he remarked, shrugging his shoulders. Yet within a few short weeks of the experience, his wife had run off with another man, and Professor Zeit, finding the girl he loved a widow, had married her.
Matthew Marsh was reading The Man Who Lived Backwards by Algernon Blackwood. The story was abridged by Robin Brooks and produced by Clive Brill. It was a Pacificus production for BBC Radio 4.
"Is what we expected, I think," said the barrister. "And I'm glad the case is over." There was no particular sign of pleasure that his defence of John Turk, the murderer, on a plea of insanity, had been successful, for no doubt he felt that no man had ever better deserved the gallows. "I'm glad too," said Johnson. He had sat in the court for 10 days watching the face of the man who had carried out one of the most brutal and cold-blooded murders of recent years. The barrister glanced up at his secretary. "Ah, I remember, yes," he said. "You want to get away for Christmas. You're going to the Alps, aren't you?" "I can catch the morning boat now," he said. "I'm glad I've seen the last of that man's dreadful face. The description of the way the dismembered body was crammed and packed with lime into that—" "Don't dwell on it, my dear fellow," interrupted the other. "Such pictures have a trick of coming back when one least wants them. Now go and enjoy your holiday." Johnson took his leave. At the door he turned suddenly. "I knew there was something I wanted to ask you," he said. "Would you mind lending me one of your kit bags? It's too late to get one tonight." "Of course. I'll send Henry over with it to your rooms. You shall have it the moment you get home." Johnson dined at his club before going back to his rooms. He occupied the top floor in one of those old gaunt houses in which the rooms are large and lofty. The floor below his own was vacant and unfurnished, and below that were other lodgers whom he did not know. In the hall he met his landlady. "This come by mail from Mr. Wilbraham, sir." She pointed to what was evidently the kit bag, and Johnson thanked her and took it upstairs with him. "And now I must pack." His employer had lent him the very thing, a stout canvas kit bag. It was not much to look at, but its capacity was unlimited. He shoved in his waterproof coat, his fur cap and gloves, and then on top of these he piled his woolen shirts. The dress suit came next, and then, thinking of the best way to pack his white shirts, he paused a moment. And as he did so, he heard footsteps coming softly up the stairs. No doubt they belonged to a late lodger. He went into his bedroom and packed his dress shirts as best he could. The kit bag by this time was 2/3 full. For the first time he noticed that it was old and dirty. He went on with his packing. Once or twice, however, he caught himself wondering who it could have been wandering down below, for the floor beneath was empty and unfurnished. From time to time, moreover, he was almost certain he heard the soft tread of someone padding about over the bare boards. Then an odd thing happened. As he left the bedroom, having just packed his recalcitrant white shirts, he noticed that the top of the kit bag lopped over towards him with an extraordinary resemblance to a human face. The canvas fell into a fold like a nose and forehead, and the brass rings for the padlock just filled the position of the eyes. A shadow, or was it a travel stain, looked like hair. It gave him rather a turn, for it was so outrageously like the face of John Turk, the murderer. He laughed and went into the front room where the light was stronger. That horrid case has got on my mind, he thought. I shall be glad of the change of scene. In the sitting-room, however, he was not pleased to hear again that stealthy tread upon the stairs, and to realize that it was much closer than before. And this time he got up and went to see who it could be creeping about on the upper staircase at so late an hour. But the sound ceased. There was no one visible on the stairs. My absurd imagination, I suppose, he thought. He went back to his packing. It was by this time getting on towards midnight. It is difficult to say exactly at what point fear begins, when the causes of that fear are not plainly before the eyes. Impressions gather on the surface of the mind, film by film, as ice gathers upon the surface of still water, but often so lightly that they claim no definite recognition from the consciousness. Johnson recognized that he felt nervous, yet he could nowhere lay his finger upon the secret of this growing uneasiness. "Pure nerves, I suppose," he said aloud with a forced laugh. "Mountain air will cure all that. That reminds me, my snow glasses." He was standing by the door of the bedroom, and as he passed quickly towards the sitting-room to fetch them from the cupboard, he saw, out of the corner of his eye, the indistinct outline of a figure standing on the stairs a few feet from the top. It was someone in a stooping position, with one hand on the banisters, and the face peering up towards the landing. The person who had been creeping about below all this time had at last come up to his own floor. What in the name of heaven did he want? After a few seconds' hesitation, Johnson found his courage and turned to investigate. The stairs, he saw to his utter amazement, were empty. He felt a series of cold shivers run over him. He almost ran into the light of the front room, but hardly had he passed inside the doorway when he heard someone come up the stairs behind him with a quick bound and go swiftly into his bedroom. And it was at this precise moment that the nervousness he had hitherto experienced leapt the boundary line and entered the state of fear, almost of acute, unreasoning fear. For some minutes he hardly knew what to think or do. Then he crossed the landing boldly and went straight into the other room. "Who's there? Is that you, Mrs. Monks?" he called aloud. "Who's there?" he called again. The curtains swayed very slightly, and as he saw it his heart missed a beat. Yet he dashed forward and drew them aside with a rush. A window streaming with rain was all that met his gaze. He stepped backwards into the middle of the room, and, as he did so, something all but tripped him up. Turning with a sudden spring of alarm, he saw the kit-bag. "Odd," he thought, "that's not where I left it." He did not remember having moved it. He went back to the front room, poked the fire into a blaze, and sat down before it to think. And it was here, just when he most desired to keep his mind and thoughts controlled, that the vivid pictures received day after day in the courtroom of the Old Bailey came strongly to light. The dreadful face of John Turk, the murderer, the white skin, the evil eyes, and the fringe of black hair low over the forehead. "This is all rubbish and nerves," he exclaimed at length, springing with sudden energy from the chair. "I shall finish my packing and go to bed." But his face was deadly white all the same. He snatched up his field-glasses and walked across to the bedroom, and the instant he crossed the threshold and stood within the room, something turned cold about his heart, and he felt that every hair on his head stood up. The kit-bag lay close in front of him, and just over its crumpled top he saw a head and face slowly sinking down out of sight as though someone were crouching behind it to hide. And at the same moment a sound like a long-drawn sigh was distinctly audible in the still air about him. At first such a wave of terror came over him that for some seconds he could do nothing but stand and stare. A violent trembling ran down his back and legs, and he was conscious of a foolish, almost a hysterical impulse to scream aloud. "Who's there?" he said at length. The tones came out in a faint whisper, for he had partly lost the control of his tongue and lips. He stepped forward so that he could see all round and over the kit bag. Of course there was nothing there, nothing but the faded carpet and the bulging canvas sides. He put out his hands and threw open the mouth of the sack where it had fallen over, and then he saw for the first time that round the inside, some 6 inches from the top, there ran a broad smear of dull crimson. It was an old and faded blood stain. He uttered a scream and drew back his hands as if they had been burnt. At the same time the kit bag gave a faint but unmistakable lurch forward toward the door. Johnson collapsed backwards, searching with his hands for the support of something solid, and the door, being further behind him than he realized, received his weight just in time to prevent his falling, and shut to with a resounding bang. At the same moment the swinging of his left arm accidentally touched the electric switch, and the light in the room went out. He groped furiously for the little brass knob to turn the light on again, but the rapid closing of the door had set the coats hanging on it a-swinging, and his fingers became entangled in a confusion of sleeves and pockets, so that it was some moments before he found the switch. And in those few moments of bewilderment and terror, 2 things happened that sent him beyond recall over the boundary into the region of genuine horror. He distinctly heard the kit bag shuffling heavily across the floor in jerks, and close in front of his face sounded once again the sigh of a human being. In his anguished efforts to find the brass button on the wall, he nearly scraped the nails from his fingers. The room was flooded again with light. There, close before him, bending over the half-packed kit bag, stood the figure of John Turk, the murderer. In a flash Johnson realized what it all meant. The dirty and much-used bag, the smear of crimson within the top, the dreadful stretched condition of the bulging sides. He remembered how the victim's body had been stuffed into a canvas bag for burial, the ghastly dismembered fragments forced with lime into this very bag, and the bag itself produced as evidence. Very softly and stealthily his hand groped behind him for the handle of the door. But before he could actually turn it, the very thing that he most of all dreaded came about, and John Turk lifted his devil's face and looked at him. At the same moment, that heavy sigh passed through the air of the room, formulated somehow into words. "It's my bag, and I want it." Johnson just remembered clawing the door open, and then falling in a heap upon the floor of the landing. He remained unconscious for a long time. When he woke, the wintry dawn was just beginning to peep in at the windows, and he managed to crawl into the front room and cover himself with an overcoat in the armchair, where at length he fell asleep. A great clamour woke him. He recognized Mrs. Monk's voice. "What? You ain't been to bed, sir? Are you ill? There's an urgent gentleman to see you, someone from Mr. Wilbraham's." Mr. Wilbraham's man came in with many apologies, and explained that the wrong kit bag had been sent over the night before. "They must have brought you the one from the murder case instead, sir, I'm afraid," the man continued. "The one John Turk packed the dead body in. Mr. Wilbraham's awfully upset about it, sir, and told me to come over first thing this morning with the right one. Beg pardon, sir, but knowing your interest in the Turk case, I thought you'd maybe like to know what's happened." "Yes. John Turk killed himself last night with poison, immediately on getting his release. and he left a note for Mr. Wilbraham saying as he'd be much obliged if they'd have him put away, same as the woman he murdered, in the old kit bag.
What time did he do it? Asked Johnson.
10 o'clock last night, sir, the warder says.
Matthew Marsh was reading The Kit Bag by Algernon Blackwood. The story was abridged by Robin Brooks and produced by Clive Brill, and it was a Pacificus production for BBC Radio 4.